Inflation adjustment clauses are nothing new to contracts, but what is uncommon is the high rate of inflation that we're currently experiencing and just how fast that inflation is rising. So whereas before it wasn't as important, now it's imperative, because if an inflation adjustment isn't accounted for, the receiver of money stands to lose a lot of the value of the contract. So you may have heard of the term nominal value. Nominal value is the face value stated on the contract. For example, if I purchase a service every month for $1,500, $1,500 is the nominal value of that contract. But we can't go by nominal value alone, especially for longer term deals, because again, we stand to lose a tremendous amount of money if we do. So in this video, we're going to go over 3 key considerations for any inflation adjustment clause in a contract. So first, you need to have a basis for the rate of inflation. And this is really, really important, because this determines how much the contract will be adjusted for. Now, traditionally, this has been the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. But as more people are realizing, this isn't a viable method for accurately calculating inflation, because the CPI skews the true rate of inflation, and the skew results in an understating of the inflation. So one alternative is shadowstats.com, and this has CPI charts that better reflect the real rate of inflation. As another option, you can create your own indices / formula for calculating inflation, and as another option, you can use a flat percentage such as 7% or whatever it is that you'd like. And then you could also have the option to opt into a higher percentage if your formula for inflation exceeds that fixed rate. But the key is that you have a reliable and agreed upon method for calculating the adjustment for inflation. As the payee, the person receiving the money, it's important that you negotiate for the true rate of inflation versus what's traditionally been accepted. So CPI has traditionally been accepted, fixed rate has traditionally been accepted, but if you accept those 2 methods for calculation, you stand to lose significant value from the contract. So another key consideration is the adjustment frequency. So you need to stipulate how often the adjustment takes place. This is actually very important. So the first layer to frequency is whether something is a one-time payment or adjustment or is recurring. If reoccurring, at what interval? Is it monthly, quarterly, biannually, or annually? Now again, traditionally, inflation adjustment has taken place annually, but in practice, it's worth accelerating payments for the payee, because if adjustment expectations surprise the payer of money, the payor, especially after an extended period, the payer may decide to breach the contract, or they may just not be able to pay. So you have to take into account practical considerations here. And that's why, this is a new environment for many people. And so when accounting for frequency, it's good, it's beneficial to the payee that payments are made more frequently. Now, it's not just because the payments are made more frequently, but you have to take into account that if the bill becomes due after a long period, and let's say it's 75% more than the payor had anticipated, they may be rethinking this whole contract and whether or not they like this inflation adjustment clause at all. Because you have to remember, people are not accustomed to just how high and quickly inflation is increasing. So you want to take into account practical considerations, and that's a general good rule for contracts. It's not just having the language in there and being technically right. It's being practically considerate and knowing ahead of time in advance, okay, I may have this accounted for in my contract, But if the other party is going to be jolted by this, then it's won't bode well for me, whether in terms of getting paid or initiating litigation. It might end up causing litigation because the other party will say, well, this is unfair. This is, maybe outside of what we considered, or they may start arguing over whether the formula is being calculated accurately. So this is a practical consideration, but again, it comes back to how often. Annually has been traditionally the route, and I think that's a long time to wait, especially in this environment. So the third consideration is the direction of adjustment, and this is not nearly as important, but it's what has happened in the past is there has been a provision for whether the basis for adjustment yields a negative number. So in this case, the contract would be less than the nominal amount because of maybe for some reason it's actually the formula that is used for the basis for inflation actually has a negative yield. And so while it is unlikely, especially right now, it is possible, especially over the short term. So as the receiver of money, obviously it's best if this isn't contemplated in the contract. You only want a situation where the contract is either paid out as the nominal value states, or there's an adjustment based on how much additional inflation erodes that initial value of the contract. So you want the contract to either stay the same or where you only stand to gain. As the payor, it's to your benefit to have this contemplation in the contract, especially for larger contracts, because it is feasible. It is possible that there is some instance whereby, especially if you have a formula that's taking into account different considerations, it is possible that there is a circumstance where, especially if if the inflation adjustment is calculated in the short term, that there is some situation where there would be a return on money. So it is good to have it both ways if you're the payor. However, it is unlikely that in this environment that you would see that money back. With this comes opportunity, right? When we're talking specifically about contracts, there are different sides to this. And so as the receiver of the money, as the payee, it's important that you alert the payor that this is not a concession. This is merely maintaining the value of the contract. So practically, if I were to approach a contract negotiation, it would be a given. Like, how are we going to adjust inflation for this? And as the payor, obviously you want no clause or a fixed clause like 3%. And at the worst case, like if you were really conceding, you would base it on CPI, because again, CPI suppresses the real inflation rate. When we are going to the grocery store, we are much more aware of what the real inflation rate is, because we know from month to month, hey, I paid $9.99 for this 2 months ago, and now it's $12.99. So that's not an 8%. That's not 8% inflation, right? It's much more. But CPI has a way of skewing the basket of price goods that it's based upon to be much lower than the true rate of inflation. So as the payor of the contract, you want something like a fixed clause, like 3%. You want to go the traditional route. And if you can get no clause at all, you stand to gain tremendously, right? Because we're going to see the value erode from that nominal price. So with that, as I was mentioning, there is tremendous opportunity as you're looking in the marketplace, if you can get deals, especially over the longer term, where inflation adjustment is to a low fixed amount, such as a fixed clause, or it's to the CPI at worst, or if it's just not contemplated and it's only based on nominal value, you stand to gain tremendously. There's a tremendous discount there. Now you need to account for. Maybe that is built into the contract. You need to account for, because a price adjustment can be built into a contract in other ways. So it could be there could be a cost of goods clause, and that would be a way of a contract accounting for inflation in some regard. Now, on the other side of this, you do have to keep in mind that you don't want to have clauses that are stacking on one another. So if you have an inflation adjustment clause and a clause for a cost of goods, you could end up paying multiples over what you should be doing. So what the idea here is that this is a way for the payee to maintain the relative value of the contract throughout the contract. This is not a gain. This is not a way to make money. It's simply a way to prevent the erosion of the value. So it is a very interesting contemplation now in 2022 and 2023 as we have seen inflation continue to rise. I think that may take we may see that slow down or stop altogether, but it ultimately will pick up. So I think what will end up happening is we will ultimately come to the question of what do we want to, what is the currency that we want to base this contract on. But that's down the line. But right now, what is happening is we need to make sure that our contracts, whatever the contracts may be, that what we are agreeing to, the value is maintained throughout the contract. Because if one party has no, if the payee does not negotiate in an inflation adjustment clause, they stand to lose a tremendous amount of value. Oh, and if you would like a summary of what I have talked about in this video, if you go to inflationadjustment.com, I will make that freely available, no subscription required. It will be on there. And furthermore, if you'd like to contact me, my contact information will be at inflationadjustment.com.